He didn't wear a uniform, didn't carry a weapon, and never stood with pride. Instead, they handed him a mop and treated him like he didn't exist. For 6 years, he quietly cleaned the floors while younger guards laughed behind his back, calling him a janitor, nothing more than background noise. But everything shifted the day an SAS major arrived. One of the guards suddenly stepped out of line, crossed the drill yard, knelt before the man they'd all dismissed, and placed a rifle in his hands. In that moment, silence swept across the base. They all realized the man they'd overlooked had a story none of them knew. Before we reveal what happened next, tell us where you're watching from in the comments and make sure to subscribe, because this moment will forever change the way you see those who stay silent. The first light of dawn crept through the narrow windows of Wellington Barracks. As the sound of soapy water splashing against metal echoed through the empty hallways, William Ashford pushed his cleaning cart methodically down the corridor, his movements deliberate and practiced after years of the same routine. At 57 years old, he possessed the kind of sturdy build that spoke of a lifetime of physical work, though his stooped posture suggested burdens that went beyond the physical demands of janitorial duties. To the young soldiers who would soon fill these halls, Ashford was simply part of the institutional landscape. He had been cleaning these floors for so long that most couldn't remember the barracks without him, a quiet presence who appeared before dawn and worked steadily through the early hours when the building still held the peaceful silence of night. His navy coveralls bore the faded insignia of facility maintenance, and his sultan pepper hair was always neatly trimmed despite the early hour of his work. The morning ritual was always the same. Ashford would begin in the eastern wing, working his way systematically through each corridor, his mop moving in precise patterns that left no streak or puddle behind. There was something almost meditative about his approach to the work, as if the repetitive motion provided him with something more valuable than mere employment. As the clock struck 6, the peaceful quiet was broken by the thundering footsteps of recruits heading to morning formation. They moved past Ashford with the casual disregard that young people often show for those they consider beneath their notice. Their boots, still learning the rhythm of military precision, occasionally scuffed the freshly cleaned surfaces, but Ashford never complained or showed irritation. "Watch where you're going, Grandpa," shouted one of the new arrivals, a cocky 19-year-old named Phillips, whose uniform still bore the creases of recent issue. His companions laughed appreciatively, the cruel humor that comes easily to those who have never faced real hardship. They saw only an old man with a mop, someone whose presence was so unremarkable that mocking him seemed like harmless sport. Ashford continued his work without acknowledging the insult, but something in his posture shifted almost imperceptibly. For just a moment, his shoulders straightened and his grip on the mop handle tightened in a way that might have reminded an observant viewer of entirely different circumstances. The sharp echo of military boots on linoleum announced a different kind of presence in the corridor. These steps carried authority and purpose, causing the laughing recruits to snap immediately to attention with the instinctive recognition that comes with military training. Their faces drained of color as they realized that their casual cruelty had been witnessed by someone whose opinion could have serious consequences for their careers. Major Ellis Grant stood at the far end of the hallway, his keen eyes taking in the scene with the analytical precision that had served him well during years of special operations. Grant was a man whose reputation preceded him, known throughout the British military as someone who had seen action in the world's most dangerous places and emerged with both his skills and his principles intact. At 42, he carried himself with the quiet confidence of someone who had nothing left to prove to anyone. But something about the scene he had witnessed troubled Grant in ways he couldn't immediately articulate. It wasn't simply the casual disrespect shown by the recruits, though that certainly warranted correction. There was something about the maintenance worker, something in the way he moved and carried himself that seemed oddly familiar, though Grant couldn't place where he might have encountered him before. The recruits remained frozen at attention as Grant approached. Their earlier bravado completely evaporated in the face of genuine authority. But Grant's attention was focused elsewhere, studying the custodian who continued to work with an efficiency that spoke of long practice. And perhaps something more. There was a precision to his movements, a kind of economical grace that reminded Grant of soldiers he had known, though he couldn't quite put his finger on why. "Carry on," Grant told the recruits, his voice carrying the kind of quiet authority that made further explanation unnecessary. They hurried away toward their formation, leaving behind only the sound of Ashford's mop and the major's steady breathing. As he continued to observe the maintenance worker with growing curiosity, Grant had developed strong instincts about people. During his years of military service, particularly the ability to recognize qualities that others might miss or overlook. Something about this custodian set off those instincts, though he couldn't yet explain what it was. The way the man held his shoulders, the precision of his movements, even the way he seemed to remain aware of his surroundings while appearing focused on his work. These were traits Grant associated with professional soldiers, not maintenance staff. 3 days later, Grant found himself in the basement archives of Wellington Barracks, surrounded by filing cabinets that held decades of military records and personnel files. He had been assigned to conduct a routine security review, cross-referencing current personnel with their background clearances, mundane administrative work that even elite soldiers sometimes found on their desks. The fluorescent lighting cast harsh shadows across the rows of manila folders as Grant methodically worked through the files, checking names against databases and ensuring that all documentation was current and complete. It was tedious work, the kind that required attention to detail, but offered little in the way of intellectual stimulation. Grant found his mind wandering back to the scene in the corridor, still puzzled by his reaction to the maintenance worker. It was purely by chance that he opened the wrong file drawer, reaching for personnel records, but instead finding himself looking at historical documents from the 1980s. The folder that caught his attention was labeled Falklands Campaign, Commendations, and Awards, and something prompted him to pull it from the drawer despite its irrelevance to his current assignment. The first few documents were routine, standard commendation letters for soldiers who had performed their duties with distinction during the brief but brutal conflict in the South Atlantic. Grant flipped through them with professional interest, noting the formal language used to describe acts of courage that had taken place in conditions few civilians could imagine. Then he found the photograph that changed everything. It was a formal, military portrait, the kind taken for official records and ceremonial purposes. The image showed a young man in the distinctive uniform of the Coldstream Guards, his posture ramrod straight, and his eyes focused directly at the camera with the kind of steady gaze that spoke of inner strength and determination. Grant stared at the photograph for several long seconds before the recognition hit him with stunning force. The face was younger, unmarked by the lines and weathering that decades of hard living had etched there. But the eyes were unmistakable. They were the same eyes he had seen just days earlier, holding a mop instead of a rifle, wearing custodial coveralls instead of dress uniform, with hands that trembled slightly from the shock of recognition. Grant read the caption beneath the photograph: Color Sergeant William Ashford, Coldstream Guards, Victoria Cross Recommendation, Falklands Campaign, 1982. The words seemed to blur as Grant tried to process their implications. The Victoria Cross, the highest military honor that could be bestowed upon British and Commonwealth forces, awarded only for acts of valor in the face of the enemy that went above and beyond any reasonable expectation of duty. Grant pulled the complete file with growing amazement, finding documents that detailed actions so extraordinary they seemed almost fictional. The official citation, written in the dry bureaucratic language of military commendations, nonetheless conveyed the breathtaking nature of what Color Sergeant Ashford had accomplished during a single engagement outside the settlement of Goose Green. According to the records, Ashford's unit had come under intense artillery fire while conducting a reconnaissance patrol in heavily contested territory. When the barrage lifted, 6 members of his squad had been wounded and pinned down by enemy machine gun fire from elevated positions that commanded excellent fields of fire. The tactical situation was desperate. Any attempt to reach the wounded men would require crossing nearly 200 meters of open ground under direct observation and fire from entrenched enemy positions. The citation described how Ashford had stripped himself of all unnecessary equipment, keeping only his rifle, medical kit, and ammunition, before beginning what could only be described as an impossible mission. 6 separate times, he had crossed that killing ground under heavy fire, each trip carrying a wounded soldier back to safety, while enemy gunners concentrated their fire on his exposed position. Grant found himself reading and rereading the dry, military prose, trying to imagine the physical and mental demands of what Ashford had accomplished. The first crossing had been made under covering fire from his remaining squad members, but as ammunition ran low and the enemy began to range in on their positions, that support had become sporadic and then non-existent. By the final crossing, Ashford had been moving alone across ground that was being swept by concentrated machine gun fire, relying on nothing but speed, determination, and what the citation diplomatically referred to as exceptional courage under fire. But the file contained another document that cast the heroic actions in a different light. A medical report, filed weeks after the engagement, detailed the psychological trauma that Ashford had suffered as a result of his actions. The last man he had attempted to rescue, Lance Corporal Daniel Morrison, had died during the final crossing, succumbing to his wounds just 50 meters from safety. Despite Ashford's desperate efforts to save him, Grant discovered that the story took an even more tragic turn when he found correspondence from the awards committee, responsible for processing Victoria Cross recommendations. The initial paperwork had been completed, the ceremony scheduled, and arrangements made for Queen Elizabeth II herself to present the medal in recognition of Ashford's extraordinary valor. Everything had been in place for what should have been one of the proudest moments in any soldier's career. Instead, Grant found a brief, formal letter from Ashford himself, submitted through proper channels just days before the scheduled ceremony. The letter was a single page, written in the precise handwriting of a professional soldier, requesting withdrawal from consideration for any decorations or commendations related to his actions in the Falklands campaign. The letter provided no detailed explanation for the request, maintaining the formal tone required by military protocol. But Grant, with his own experience of combat and its aftermath, could read between the lines. The man who had risked everything to save his comrades could not accept recognition for actions that, in his own mind, represented his greatest failure, rather than his finest hour. The guilt of being unable to save Morrison, combined with the trauma of watching his friend die in his arms, had transformed an act of extraordinary heroism into a source of unbearable shame. Grant spent the next several hours tracking down additional documentation, piecing together what had happened to Ashford in the years following the Falklands. The records showed a pattern that was both heartbreaking and frustratingly common among combat veterans: a gradual withdrawal from the things that had once defined his identity as a soldier. Ashford had completed his tour of duty in the Falklands with distinction, but upon returning to England had requested transfer to administrative duties. His superiors had been puzzled by the request, given his outstanding record and the career advancement opportunities that his wartime service had opened up. Here was a man who could have written his own ticket to senior leadership positions, who could have commanded battalions or served in the highest levels of military planning. Instead, Ashford had chosen to fade into the background, accepting assignments that kept him away from combat units and frontline responsibilities. For 15 years, he had served competently but without distinction in various administrative roles, always meeting his obligations but never seeking advancement or recognition. Grant's investigation revealed that when Ashford had reached retirement age, he had made one final request that had surprised even those who thought they understood his desire for anonymity. Rather than accepting his pension and leaving military life behind, he had asked for permission to remain at Wellington Barracks as civilian maintenance staff. The request had been unusual but not unprecedented, and given his years of faithful service, it had been granted without extensive consideration. What no one had understood at the time was why a man with Ashford's qualifications and experience would choose to spend his retirement years performing menial labor in the same facilities where he had once served as a leader of men. The official explanation, recorded in his personnel file, was simply that he desired to remain connected to military life in his retirement years. The truth, as Grant began to understand it, was far more complex and tragic. Ashford needed the structure and routine of military life, needed to be surrounded by the sounds and rhythms of barracks life even if his role in it had fundamentally changed. In his own quiet way, he was still serving, still taking care of the young soldiers who wore the uniform he had once worn with such distinction. Grant made contact with Colonel James Harrison, now retired, who had commanded Ashford's unit during the Falklands campaign. Harrison lived in Devon, in a cottage overlooking the moors, surrounded by the memorabilia of a long and distinguished military career. The old colonel's eyes had grown distant when Grant explained the purpose of his visit, and he had poured two generous measures of whiskey before settling into his favorite chair. "Bill Ashford was the finest soldier I ever had the privilege to command," Harrison had said, his voice heavy with old grief. "He had that rare combination of physical courage and moral strength that makes a man into a natural leader." The younger soldiers looked up to him, and the officers trusted his judgment implicitly. If there was a difficult mission or a dangerous assignment, Bill was always the first to volunteer. But Harrison also spoke of the change that had come over Ashford after Morrison's death, a transformation that had been painful for everyone who knew him to witness. The easy confidence that had characterized his leadership had been replaced by a kind of desperate competence, as if he were trying to prove something to himself that no one else required proof of. Colonel Harrison described how Ashford had continued to perform his duties flawlessly in the weeks following the Goose Green engagement, but the joy that had once characterized his service had disappeared entirely. Where once he had been known for his dry humor and ability to maintain morale even in the most difficult circumstances, he had become withdrawn and increasingly isolated from his fellow soldiers. It was like watching a man drown in slow motion, Harrison had explained, swirling the whiskey in his glass as he recalled those difficult days. He was still there, still doing everything that was asked of him and more. But you could see that something fundamental had broken inside him. We all tried to help, tried to get him to talk about what had happened. But Bill had always been a private man. After Morrison's death, he became almost completely unreachable. Grant learned that Ashford's nighttime cleaning routines at Wellington barracks were not simply the result of dedication to his job, but rather a coping mechanism for dealing with insomnia and recurring nightmares that had plagued him for decades. The security guards who worked night shifts had grown accustomed to seeing him moving through the halls during the small hours, mop and bucket in hand, his face bearing an expression of profound sadness that none of them had ever felt qualified to address. Harrison had also provided Grant with contact information for other members of Ashford's old unit, veterans who had witnessed his actions firsthand and could speak to the extraordinary nature of what he had accomplished. Over the following days, Grant reached out to these men, now scattered across the country, many of them dealing with their own struggles related to their wartime service. The stories they told painted a consistent picture of a man who had embodied the very best of military virtues. They spoke of Ashford's willingness to share his rations when supplies were short, his habit of taking the most dangerous assignments to spare his younger soldiers, and his ability to maintain hope and determination, even when circumstances seemed hopeless. When Bill told you everything would be all right, you believed him, one veteran had said during a phone conversation, even when the evidence suggested otherwise. Even when we were cold and hungry and scared, he had a way of making you feel that as long as he was there, things would work out somehow. Grant's investigation also revealed the full extent of Ashford's nightly rituals. At Wellington Barracks, after the building had settled into the quiet of night watch, while the young recruits slept peacefully in their beds, Ashford would make his way to the memorial wall that honored the regiment's fallen. There, in the dim light of the emergency lighting, he would stand before the black marble that bore the names of soldiers who had died in service to their country. Among those names was Lance Corporal Daniel Morrison, added posthumously to commemorate the young man who had died in Ashford's arms on a windswept hillside half a world away. Ashford had been the one to recommend Morrison for inclusion on the memorial, though he had never mentioned his personal connection to the fallen soldier in his formal recommendation. The night security guards had observed these vigils for years without fully understanding their significance. To them, Ashford was simply a dedicated employee who took exceptional pride in maintaining the building where he worked. They had no way of knowing that his late-night presence at the memorial represented a kind of ongoing conversation with ghosts, a ritual of remembrance and regret that had continued uninterrupted for more than 2 decades. Grant began to understand that Ashford's choice to work as a custodian was not simply about maintaining a connection to military life, but rather a form of penance for actions that he viewed as failures rather than heroic achievements. In his mind, he had failed in the only way that truly mattered. He had been unable to save the life of the man who mattered most to him. The irony was devastating in its completeness. The same actions that had saved 6 lives and earned him recommendation for the highest military honor had also cost him the one life that, in his judgment, had been most worth saving. No amount of recognition or decoration could change that fundamental equation in his mind. As Grant's understanding of Ashford's story deepened, he felt increasingly compelled to take action. Here was a genuine hero, a man whose actions had embodied the very best traditions of military service, and he was being treated as invisible by the very institution he had served with such distinction. The injustice of it troubled Grant's sense of fairness and his understanding of what the military owed to its most dedicated servants. Grant began to develop a plan for recognition that would respect Ashford's desire for privacy, while also ensuring that his service received the acknowledgement it deserved. The key would be finding a way to honor him without causing the kind of public attention that might reopen psychological wounds that time had never fully healed. Grant's first step was to request access to classified combat footage from the Falklands campaign, film taken by military photographers and reconnaissance personnel during the height of the fighting. The request required approval from several levels of command, but Grant's reputation and security clearance eventually provided him with access to materials that few people had ever seen. What he found exceeded his expectations. Among the hours of grainy, often poorly lit footage, Grant discovered actual film of Ashford's actions on the hillside outside Goose Green. The quality was poor, shot from a considerable distance by a cameraman who had been more concerned with survival than cinematography, but the footage was unmistakably authentic, even in the poor resolution and at significant distance. The film captured something of the extraordinary nature of what Ashford had accomplished. The footage showed a lone figure moving repeatedly across an area of open ground, while artillery bursts and muzzle flashes lit up the surrounding terrain. The scale of the undertaking became clear when the camera occasionally pulled back to show the full extent of the killing ground that Ashford had crossed 6 times under direct enemy fire. Grant had spent considerable time preparing for the moment when he would reveal Ashford's true identity to the current generation of soldiers at Wellington Barracks. He understood that the revelation would need to be handled carefully, both to respect Ashford's dignity and to ensure that the lesson would have maximum impact on the young men who had treated him with such casual disrespect. That Tuesday morning, when Grant entered the corridor and witnessed the familiar scene of recruits mocking the custodian, he realized that the moment he had been preparing for had finally arrived. The contrast between their casual cruelty and Ashford's quiet dignity crystallized everything that Grant had learned about the man and his service. As Grant approached Ashford and made his formal recognition, extending his own service rifle in a gesture of respect, the moment carried meaning that transcended simple military courtesy. It was an acknowledgement of service that had gone unrecognized for too long, a restoration of honor that had been hidden rather than lost. The recruits who had been laughing just moments before found themselves confronted with a reality that challenged everything they thought they understood about service and sacrifice. The man they had dismissed as part of the furniture was revealed as someone whose actions had embodied the very ideals they were training to uphold. When Ashford finally turned to face Grant and the assembled soldiers, his weathered face bore traces of tears, but they were not tears of shame or embarrassment. They were the tears of a man who had spent decades believing himself unworthy of respect, only to discover that his service had been seen and valued by those who understood its true meaning. The transformation was immediate and profound. Grant's simple gesture of recognition had accomplished what years of therapy and medical treatment had failed to achieve. It had returned William Ashford to his rightful place in the community of soldiers, not as a broken veteran hiding from his past, but as a man whose sacrifices had earned him the eternal gratitude of those who understood the true cost of freedom. In that moment, the custodian with the mop disappeared forever, replaced by the color sergeant who had never truly left but had simply been waiting in the shadows for someone to finally see him clearly and acknowledge the hero that had been there all along.